Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Kamish Orr, and we are going to be looking at some MLB data from the 2022 season again, continuing that series. Today, I'm actually going to answer a question that somebody actually requested this on my one of my videos, one of the MLB data videos. They wanted to know about the error breakdown between one base errors and two base errors. What was the breakdown of that? How many one base errors were there compared to two base errors and that kind of thing. So I hadn't had that on my radar to take a look at that, but it seemed intriguing. So I thought I would add that to my list and do some research on that. And so I'm going to bring you that research today. And I think we'll find some surprising things about the data. So let's take a look. All right, as always, a couple of caveats here. Keep in mind, I had to get a little tricky with some of this. The play-by-play data that I get from Retrosheet only shows the end result, so sometimes it makes it a little hard to determine how the error was made exactly. I did do some filtering to filter out only to show only those plays in which an error was the primary play made. So what we don't have is, well, we'll get to that in a second. I only focused on errors made by infielders. Plays made in the infield that were errors. These aren't going to be errors where there was another play involved, meaning not errors on stolen base attempts, not errors on bunt attempts. I got rid of all the bunt data. Not errors where a player advanced and then there was an error later on in the play. It's only where an error was the primary result. So keep that in mind. There also the other thing to note, there are designations in there on throwing, where it says about throwing. I'm assuming that means that the errors that involve the TH designation for throwing were throwing errors as compared to fielding errors. If I'm wrong on that, please somebody let me know in the comments if you think that that's incorrect. But I'm pretty sure that that's correct, and the data kind of supports that as well. When I'm talking about one or two base errors here in the video, I'm referring to how far the batter advances on the play. So one base errors for me are when the batter gets to first base on the error, and two base errors to me are when the batter gets to second base on the error. So that's just something else to keep in mind too. I'm not talking about where the runners who are already on base, how far they advance. I'm only talking about where the batter ends up. And that's the other thing to note. I only know where the batter ended up. I don't know the exact details of the plays. Again, some of it's I think is pretty intuitive and self-explanatory. So I think for the most part, the data is going to be pretty accurate. They're, plus or minus. I always say plus or minus because there could be some weird plays that kind of don't fit the mold, as it were. Overall, there were almost 1,000 total infield errors. Again, these don't include errors on other plays that were made. So if there's a double play attempt and they get the first out, and then there's an error in trying to get the second out, that isn't shown in the data because I just really wanted to filter out and just get the pure errors, the pure error plays. So those won't be shown. The other thing to note is I did look at, because Retrosheet does give us information on whether it's a ground ball, line drive, or pop-up. And I did look at those, but a vast majority of the plays were ground ball errors. Only a handful were line drive errors or pop-up errors, where a player either dropped the pop-up or there was a line drive hit to them and they bobbled it. Almost every one of these errors is a ground ball error. There are, as I said, there are a handful that aren't, but I didn't break those down because I don't think statistically it was significant. So let's take a look at the data and see what we see. First of all, I broke it down. There were one base errors, there were two base errors, and believe it or not, there were 4 3 base errors where an error on the play led to the batter reaching third base on the play. My guess is those are pretty crazy plays for that to happen. So that's something to note. Those are outliers as compared to the other ones. The other thing that I did is I broke down fielding versus throwing, as I mentioned before. Some errors had a TH designation on them, and I classified those as throwing errors. So if we look at the one base errors, and I broke it down by position also, broke it down by position. So what you see here, like many of my other videos, is the top section is the raw data, the raw numbers, and then I look at the percentages down below here. And so if we take a look at the raw data, we see, for example, that pitchers made 66 errors in 2022. This is all based on 2022 MLB data. Catchers made 7. First baseman made 115. Second baseman 161. Third baseman 304, and shortstops 344. And that's how I get to my total of almost 1,000 errors. Again, there were other errors that took place this year, even by infielders, but some of those took place when there was another, in the midst of another play being made. So as we can see here, just by the percentage breakdown, 2/3 of the one base errors are fielding errors, and roughly, and the other third are the throwing errors. Now, in most cases, and again, I compare this to tabletop baseball sims because that's kind of what I'm involved in and what made me want to look at this data. And I think we'll find some interesting things as we look at this stuff because traditionally I think of one base errors as fielding errors and two base errors as throwing errors. At least that's what I've always thought for the most part. But it's not exactly true. As we see, only 2/3 of the one base errors are fielding errors, excuse me. Another third are throwing errors. So a lot more throwing errors on one base errors than I would have expected. Maybe you guys view it differently, but that's what I've always viewed. Overall, almost 87% of all these errors were one base errors, which makes sense because again, all of these are infield errors, and so it's more rare for the batter to get to second base when there's an error in the infield. If we look at two base errors, again, I would have expected that all of these or almost all of these were throwing errors, and a majority of them were, but still only 70% of the two base errors were throwing errors. 30% of them were fielding errors. So again, much higher percentage of fielding errors than I would have expected from two base errors. We can see the breakdown. I mean, catchers, we're only talking about a couple of two base errors total. And overall, if we look at the raw data, you can see that we're not looking at big numbers for any of the positions. So it's kind of, you don't want to put too much emphasis on an individual position because there just aren't a lot of two base errors, for example, made by any of the infielders. Third basemen make the most with 46. 70% of those throwing errors, which makes sense. And 30% fielding, almost matching exactly the overall totals. Shortstops didn't make hardly any fielding errors for two bases. Most of them were throwing errors and so on. But again, we're looking at low totals here for two base errors for any one position. And as I said, you can see the fielding versus throwing breakdown on one base errors as well. The other interesting thing I found was that the first baseman made 14 throwing errors, 14 one base throwing errors, which at first made me wonder about the data. But then I thought about it, and I'm guessing that a lot of those cases are where the first baseman is throwing to a pitcher or whoever covering first base because they've fielded the ball off the bag. So my guess is that's where that's coming from. Yeah, that's my guess on that one. We don't see that they made any two base throwing errors here, but they did make 14 one base throwing errors, and I'm guessing that's what's happened in those cases. Yeah, so that's kind of the breakdown again. Almost every two base error that a pitcher makes is a throwing error, which again makes sense intuitively to me. Second baseman didn't make very many throwing errors at all, or excuse me, two base errors at all. Maybe because they're closer to first base, so there weren't as many opportunities for the ball to get that far away for the batter to take second base. Now let's break it down a little bit further and see what happens to other base runners on the one base and two base errors. Because remember, I said one base error, the batter gets to first, two base error, the batter gets to second. But what happens to the runners on base? If you play tabletop sims like I do, you know that if there's a one base error, almost every time, all the runners advance one base. And if there's a two base error, the runners advance two bases. That's just the general rule. Are there games that don't follow that rule? Are there games where the runners advance a different number of bases than the number of bases that the batter gets on the error? Let me know in the comments if that's the case, because, well, if we look at the data here, we're going to be surprised if we're expecting that. So here's the raw data for one base errors, which, remember, there were 867 one base errors. Okay. Now, a majority of those were with the bases empty. Majority of those were with the bases empty, so we don't need to worry about what happens to the runners in those cases. But I did look at what happens to a runner on first, runner on second, and runner on third. And when I say runner on first, that is any time a runner is on first base. So it could be runners on first and second, it could be runners on first and third, it could be the bases loaded, or it could just be a runner on first. But it's any time there's a runner on first. Likewise, when I say runner on second, it's any time there was a runner on second. That's why these totals, if you try to add them up, add up to more than 867, because if there's a runner on first and second, they're going to be included in this runner on first category, but they're also going to be included on the runner on second category, which is fine. I wanted to see what happened to those runners. All right, so for one base errors, I highlighted in yellow the results where the runner also only moved up one base. So the runner on first moved to second, for example, or the runner on second moved to third, or the runner on third scored. Okay? So I took a look at that, and if we look, again, most games that I've seen, if it's a one base error, the runners all advance just one base. But when we look at the data, that's not really what happens. Yes, it happens a majority of the time, but it doesn't happen all of the time, or even almost all of the time. So with a one base error, the runner moves from first to second, and just first to second, 3/4 of the time, but he moves to third a quarter of the time also. So on a one base error, the runner moves from first to third a quarter of the time. And of course, as one would expect, that varies based on which fielder made the error. So, if it's hit back to the pitcher or if it's the catcher, then for the most part, the runner's staying at second base. The runner on first is moving just to second. Same if it's hit to first base. It's about 3-1 split here. But second base, now we're getting to the point where almost half the time, 42% of the time, the runner's moving to third on a one base error, which makes sense. The ball's hit to the right side. Batter stays at first because the ball was hit to the right side. And that runner is moving to third because the ball's hit to the right side. So that kind of makes sense. And of course, the percentage is lower when the ball's hit to the left side. But even then, almost 20% of the time, that runner's getting from first to third. Very interesting. So if you look at runner on second, what happens to a runner on second? We see that, again, a majority of the time, the runner's moving one base from second to third, but only 58% of the time is that happening. Almost 30% of the time, that runner on second's scoring on a one base error. And again, it varies based on position. So over half the time, on an error on the first baseman, the runner on second scoring on a one base error. A third of the time on balls hit to second, the runner scoring from second. Almost a quarter of the time, an error made by the shortstop allows the runner on second to score on a one base error, and so on. Interestingly enough, we look up here, runner on second holds. There were cases when there were errors made by the third baseman or shortstop where the runner stayed on second base and did not advance at all on a one base error, which makes sense because the ball's hit to the left side, and maybe it's hit right at the shortstop, and the shortstop bobbles it. The runner on second doesn't have enough time to get to third, so he just holds up, which makes sense. And of course, with a runner on third, he's scoring almost all the time on any one base error, but not all the time. There are a few cases where they don't. And by a few, I literally mean a few. One time when the error was made by the third base, twice when the error was made by the shortstop, where the runner on third holds up and doesn't score. But for the most part, they're scoring. So overall, the thing I think that was most surprising to me about a one base error is that even though a majority of the time the runners advance one base, not all the time, except for a runner on third, almost all the time they're going to score. But runners on first or runners on second, a majority of the time they're advancing one base, but there is a good percentage of the time that they're advancing more than one base. So very interesting to me to note that. I don't know that there are many tabletop games out there that really account for that correctly. At least the ones that I've played do not. So again, let me know in the comments if there are games that are nuanced enough to take that into account. My guess is, just for simplicity's sake, most games just on a one base error, you advance one base, two base error, two bases, and leave it at that. Again, I'm sure for simplicity's sake that happens, but interesting to note that that's not quite accurate. Finally, if we look at two base errors, where the batter makes it to second, again, not as many overall, so we're looking at very small sample sizes here. And again, I've highlighted in yellow where the runner gets two bases on the two base error. We can see again that a quarter of the time the runner on first is scoring on a two base error. Only 3/4 of the time is he holding at third. Now, runner on second is scoring almost 90% of the time. So almost all the time, the runner on second is scoring on a two base error. But there are cases, and again, they occur when the error is made to the left side. Though two base errors, some of those may be throwing errors, where the runner on second only makes it to third. And of course, every time the runner on third is scoring on a two base error. Every time the runner on third is scoring on a two base error. So that's not surprising. So there you have it. That's a little bit of a breakdown on error, the error distribution. That is a breakdown on the number of one base versus two base errors. We can see a vast majority are one base errors. 13% roughly are two base errors, and then almost 0.5% are three base errors. With 2/3 of those being fielding errors on one base errors, and only 30% being fielding errors on two base errors. So a little interesting breakdown. And we've also taken a look at what happens to the runners on base during a one or two base error. How far do they advance? So I think that's where we'll leave things. I hope you found that interesting, as interesting as I did. I hadn't really considered it too much before, but it definitely goes against conventional wisdom for me in what happens. Now, I know that no tabletop baseball game out there can account for all of the strange things that happen during a baseball game. So by no means is this a slight on the games out there that don't account or don't go into that much detail. But interesting to note that that these are things that don't happen every time, yet they're treated as if they do. So pretty interesting. If you have any comments, leave those down below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have other ideas for me to check out, feel free to do that as well. Just to give you a little bit of a preview, I have already done the stat analysis on runners on second or second and third, so the no force situations, ground outs with no force situations, to see what happens to those runners. How often does that runner on third score on a ground ball to different infielders? I've also looked at runners on first and third to look at what happens to those runners. How often does that runner on third score when there's a force out situation? And then I've also looked at runner on second only. How often does that runner move to third on balls hit to the right side of or left side of the infield, and that kind of thing. So those are videos that are kind of in the pipeline that I'll be coming up to next. But I thought I'd check out this one since it was a request. You too can do your request down below, and I'll try to do any analysis that I can get my hands on. So with all that said, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. If you like these kind of videos, click the like button. Consider subscribing if you don't want to miss anything. And until next time, have a great evening.